Thank you very much for being here today. I'm thrilled to see so many young people in the audience. One of my jobs as associate curator, as Sharon mentioned, is to manage our ongoing oral history project. This is an ongoing audiovisual initiative that captures stories of the 1960s, where people were when President Kennedy was shot, but also how the history and culture of that time period affected their lives and help us to better understand where we are today. And our speaker is one of those gifted storytellers whose story really spans the course of the 1960s and takes him to a number of different locations. We're going to talk about President Kennedy and the assassination, but we're also going to talk about civil rights and the Vietnam War. And we're going to cover a lot of ground today. You should have gotten question cards when you arrived today, so if you'll think about questions you'd like to ask our speaker, we're going to allow plenty of time at the end of today's program to take those questions. We'll be collecting those later on in the program. And with that, I hope you will join me in welcoming Eddie Griffin to tell his story with us today.
Eddie, I want to thank you, Steve, and I want to thank the staff here for inviting me to the museum at Dealey Plaza. And most of all, I want to thank God for giving me the time that I've had to go through and live these experiences and to be able to tell about them.
Wonderful. We're glad you could be here with us. And let's start our story today and set the scene. June of 1963, President Kennedy delivers a televised address on civil rights. That's the picture we're looking at right here. Now, President Kennedy, of course, came out in support of civil rights in a way that his predecessor, President Eisenhower, never had. What did this mean to you, living in segregated Fort Worth at the time, for the President of the United States to really speak out in terms of his commitment to civil rights?
It was a life changer for us because here was the President of the United States saying that we all were entitled to freedoms as an American citizen, except if you were a Negro. You were entitled to quality education and opportunity, except if you were a Negro. And so he would always cap off a phrase in his speech, that particular speech, with except that you are a Negro. And it was at that point that he announced that his administration was going to take proactive steps to provide education and opportunity for the Negro. And so for me, I was a senior in high school, and that was the decision maker for me to have the opportunity to attend one of the best engineering schools in the area, and I didn't have to go way off to college. I could commute back and forth to Arlington State College.
Give us a sense, growing up in Fort Worth at the time, what was segregated life like? Give us a sense of the separate restrooms, the separate drinking fountains that you had to deal with as a young person.
Well, we were talking about some of the experiences we had growing up. You have to realize that growing up in the late 40s and 50s and early 60s was my childhood experience. And we remembered the colored water fountains. And I tell you a little secret about the difference between the colored water fountain and the white water fountain, because I was curious. You know, we had to learn how to read before, you know, what is colored and what is white, because a 2-year-old don't know which fountain to drink out of. And so just out of curiosity, I wanted to know what was the difference between the colored fountain and white fountain. The white fountain had cold water, and the colored fountains had lukewarm water. Also, if you notice, I noticed on my birth certificate I was born on Jennings Avenue, which was a rich addition, and that, but our houses were always the /1/2. Our houses faced the alley, so we didn't live on Jennings, but we lived on Jennings Alley, and that's where the black community was in that particular section of town. Is our houses faced the alley, wherein the people that they work for, their houses faced the street. And unless there was no other way to make your way from alley to alley, you couldn't walk on the streets. We were not allowed to walk on, quote unquote, the white man's sidewalk. We had to walk in the gutter. So they called us gutter rats and stuff like that. These were some of the early experiences as a child. As a child, we couldn't do anything about it, but we definitely had shaped some attitudes, and one of the things that we did resent was being called Negroes. We never did buy into, not even when Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy would refer to black people as being Negroes. That was something that was unacceptable to us, because Negro signified being oppressed, having an inferiority complex, and stuff like that.
How did your parents explain segregation to you as a young boy, make you aware of the differences and what to anticipate in life?
They just told us the do's and the don'ts and the precautions. We were cautioned about being caught after dark in strange places. We were cautioned as to when to cross the street if we saw something approaching us, and we pretty much stayed out of the public and stayed pretty much in our little clustered community in order to avoid conflict. They didn't shield us altogether from segregation, but they were teaching us how to cope with it. And the one experience about living in the alley was every morning a red flatbed truck would come through and take all of the colored people out into the cotton field. That was one of the things that I wanted to do so bad, but my parents would always tell me, no, you're going to do something better. You're going to be somebody. You're going to reach greater heights. So we were programmed to do better, to accomplish more in life than they themselves were able to accomplish. And even our teachers were kind of like lifting us up. A lot of them had master's degrees, PhDs, that could not find work that was comparable for their expertise. And they were kind of like lifting us up on their shoulder to get us to reach new heights that they had never been able to accomplish, to open new doors. And so that's what we look forward to in life.
So you're a senior in high school in 1963, and you find out that President Kennedy is coming to Fort Worth, your city. Were you excited about the chance to get to see him?
We were excited and fearful.
Why fearful?
I say fearful because anytime anytime you have a lot of, if I can say it, a lot of whites didn't like Kennedy because of his position against George Wallace in Alabama. George Wallace declared segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, and he was using state troops to block the way to integration. And Kennedy turned the tables on him, federalized the state troopers and forced integration. Well, a lot of people resented being forced into integration. And they were referring to the president as being the quote unquote nigger loving president, if you pardon the expression. And then they would turn around and look at you and say, "Oh, we didn't mean any offense to you." Well, what did you just call my president? You know, how am I supposed to feel about that? So we knew that that kind of hostility out there in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, more so in Dallas and Fort Worth, because they literally editorialized their animosity toward him. And we knew that there was a foreboding that his life was in danger. So when you look at the Fort Worth film with him coming in that night, you will see black people in the background, in the dark, shouting, "We love you, Mr. President. God bless you, Mr. President." And so that was kind of, that was our only chance to see him. And that was the only message that we could convey to him before his assassination the next day.
Well, let's take a look at that film you mentioned. This is from the museum's Roy Cooper KTVT collection, and it's silent film. So, Eddie, I'm going to ask you to narrate it. You were part of a group that went out there and were standing in front of the Hotel Texas when the Kennedys arrived on Thursday, November 21st. So let's take a look at this here.
But that's the sign that I remember. And you'd have to look over the whites into the back of this crowd. It was about 4,000 or 5,000 people. And at the time, like I said, the black people were pushed into the back, and it was rude for a black person to barge their way through the crowd. Now, this moment I remember really in particular is because we were back in the crowd, and a rumor circulated that Kennedy had gotten out on the wrong side of the limousine, and he was coming over to shake hands with people. And you'll see a few black faces that forced their way through the crowd, which was considered rude for black people to force their way in front of white people to shake the hand of the president. But I remember the surge of the crowd going forward. Everybody was like pushing to get up there to touch him, to shake his hand. And so, plus that night, you can't see it from here, but they had silhouetted all the buildings in downtown Fort Worth with yellow lights, yellow Christmas lights. And it was a surprise. And we thought that they're going to put the lights up and maybe leave them up until after Christmas and then take the lights down. But it didn't happen that way, because the next night when he was assassinated, those lights have burned in the city, on the city buildings ever since. And I noticed that a lot of other cities kind of emulate Fort Worth in silhouetting their buildings with yellow lights.
Well, it certainly looks here like the president received a very enthusiastic welcome, not just that night, but then the next day outside the Hotel Texas, where he gave a speech prior to the Chamber of Commerce breakfast inside. Now,
if you notice that one black man in the midst of that whole crowd, he got close enough to shake the president's hand. That was awesome for us. That was unbelievable. We couldn't even imagine getting that close to the president. But it was a time that black people began to assert themselves, because here was a man who said he was opening the doors of opportunity to African Americans that had been previously closed for generations, ever since we had been liberated in 1865.
Eddie, take me back to November 22nd and tell me where you were when you learned of the assassination.
Some schools were let out. Our school wasn't let out, so we were at school, and it was about lunchtime, and we were sitting on the steps listening to this new device, this high-tech device they call a transistor radio. And then, and then we heard this announcement say, the president has been shot. And it was devastating. And we sat there and we held the radio and we kept waiting for another report, another. If you missed that first announcement, then the next announcement was the president is dead. So it was a once in a lifetime. You hear it. If you heard it, you would never forget it. If you didn't hear it, they can only tell you about it secondhand. But we heard it firsthand.
Now, you mentioned earlier about the hostility, particularly in Dallas, where the Dallas Morning News was very adamant in their beliefs. Did it surprise you that if the president was going to be shot and killed, that it would happen in a place like Dallas?
Well, if he had listened to what we had been wishing and saying was, don't go to Dallas. It was almost prophetic, almost like the prophecy of Kennedy. The Kennedy in the 1800s gave to President Lincoln. It was a Kennedy that warned Lincoln not to go somewhere where he wound up being assassinated. Well, Dallas was very hostile and very open about their hostility. And we didn't want to see Kennedy go to Dallas. And that's the reason why we gave him the send-off that we did. We love you, Mr. President. We wanted him to know that we truly appreciated what he had done for African-American people.
Did you initially think that Kennedy was shot by a segregationist, someone that killed him because of his support of civil rights?
Well, all we know is that Dallas did it. And that's the way we looked at it. We didn't look at segregationists, race hater, or anything like that. All we looked at was Dallas, you are guilty. You killed our president.
What was the rest of that weekend like for you?
The rest of the weekend, I think we were all glued to the TV. And then come that Sunday morning, TV had never stayed on all night. There was no 24-hour coverage. And all of a sudden, we had 24-hour coverage, and we listened to the TV and watched TV all night. And come that Sunday morning, Lee Harvey Oswald gets shot right on live TV.
I want to move the story along a little bit because we want to talk about your activism, because you were very involved in particularly the mid to late 60s. Let's jump ahead to Arlington State College. We're looking at a very interesting picture here of the Confederate battle flag on campus. Now, Arlington State, as I understand it, had an Old South theme. They flew the Confederate battle flag every day on campus. How did this Old South theme, this devotion to the Confederacy, how did this mesh with your views on civil rights?
Well, to tell the truth, we only knew about the civil rights movement. We heard about Martin Luther King and all the things that were happening in the South. But when we went to college, this is what we were confronted with, a Confederate flag flying at the top of the flagpole where the United States flag never flew. It was like the Confederacy never died here. And when they had Old South Week, it was like the kids would dress up in their great grandpa's Confederate uniform with sword and all and come to school and celebrate. And they would have some of their friends in blackface and put nooses around their neck and drag them around campus. And this was our third year of integration. And this is what we were looking at. And it was like the University of Mississippi. That was another college that never flew the United States flag. They always flew the Confederate flag. So we had to bring old Dixie down. I think that's the reason why they wrote that song. The night they brought old Dixie down, that was us.
Now, there was a very dramatic moment when one of the professors at Arlington State took down the Confederate flag, and you were part of that. You were part of his guard, I suppose. Tell us that story.
Yeah, well, he did some. This was Dr. Alan Sachs. First of all, they called him a nigger-loving Jew. He was our college professor, political science. He allowed us freedom of speech in class. And after class, the class would spill over into different rooms, and we would have roundtable discussions, and we would talk about civil rights, and we would talk about this Confederate flag and he took it down. We thought they were going to kill him. And they confronted him. And they were very hostile toward him, and we had to come to his rescue. I think we dished the nonviolent theme at that point because of the threats to life. And I think my friend Ernie McMillan, who was part of the last year's series, Ernie McMillan was one who did arm himself, but for self-protection. And so we surrounded Dr. Sachs and protected him against the mob. But that was the type of intimidation and hostilities that we had to face on a daily basis just to go to school. We began to take some proactive steps to bring old Dixie down, and some of them were iffy. Some were legal and some were not so legal.
You were part of an effort to establish a chapter of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee on campus.
That was Ernie. Ernie recruited us to SNCC. I didn't know what SNCC was, a Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee. I was hesitant about being nonviolent because I was watching too many people in the South getting beat up and dogs sicked on them and all of that. But it was a student movement, and that was the key, is that the student movement was something separate and apart from Martin Luther King's civil rights, equal rights movement. And by that I mean this: we fought for the right to vote for the 18-year-olds. We burned our draft cards. We began an anti-war protest. We began demanding black studies in all the colleges and the university because they didn't have a black curriculum, and a lot of other things. And after a while, the women noticed that all the men occupied all the positions, and so a rift arose that became the women's movement. So we had all these movements going on at the same time. during the 1960s. And sometimes they worked together. And the black movement broke off from the white movement. We worked together before, but the white individuals that were part of the movement were asked to deal with the white side of the population, and we would deal with the black side. So you had this thing of they called the Black Revolution, and some of the principles that was involved in that eventually circulated around through all the college campuses. Your Stokely Carmichael and your H. Rap Brown, and all of us were shouting Black Power. So that's what Black Power did not mean anti-white power. It meant black political power, because at that time we did not have universal right to vote. And so a lot of our people were involved in Southern voter registration drives and stuff like that.
1968, Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. are both assassinated. And in previous conversations, you said that this was the moment when things really started to fall apart. Hope had been assassinated with these two men, and you became more militant in your activism. Take us back to 68. Tell us what was going through your mind.
Well, when we integrated the colleges and universities, we thought that we were forging ahead to fulfill the promise that John Kennedy had made, and that Martin Luther King, although we disagreed with him on a lot of things, and people think I'm blasphemous when I tell them that we disagree with Martin Luther King, but he was the spokesman who had access to the White House, and so we allowed him to speak for our generation. And then when they assassinated him, we had nobody except ourselves. And so that's when it became when the revolution took on a different tone. We didn't know what was happening. We knew that there had been quite a few assassinations. Medgar Evers had been assassinated, and Dahmer had been assassinated, and some of the civil rights workers in Mississippi had been murdered, and all of that. And some of us just went out and armed ourselves, for self-defense. People talk about Second Amendment rights. It's okay, Second Amendment rights, if you are a certain persuasion and color of skin. But if you talk about Second Amendment right, and you're a black person who's been oppressed, then it becomes like perceived as an act of terror. So that was the way that came off.
You became active with the Black Panthers, and you gained a nickname. They called you the Black Robin Hood. Tell us how that nickname came about, and the legend that's associated with that.
It wasn't my friends that called me the Black Robin Hood, and I didn't name myself the Black Robin Hood. The Texas Rangers and FBI and law enforcement called me the Black Robin Hood, and it was actually started by my lawyer, who, after an unsuccessful bank robbery, in which they said, as legend have it, that we robbed the bank, took women hostage, absconded with a squad car, and rode around the black community throwing money out the window. That's how the nickname, the Black Robin Hood, came about. And so that's, people will say anything if they see that you're going to prison for a long time and may never come back. They create these stories. I knew about that, but that's how the nickname came about, the Black Robin Hood, as a result of some of the robberies and some of the things that we did in order to survive. And let me assure you that that it's more complicated than, the fall guy. The fall guy may be the guy that shows up on the camera in the bank, but you have other elements that are involved also, the setup people who set it up from the inside. And so you'll find that a lot of what appears on the news and in the newspaper says one thing, but when you dig to find out the fact, you will find out that there is more to it than that. And let me assure you that that we were conspicuous to be the fall guys, and we agreed to that. That if anything goes wrong, we're the fall guys. If this bank robbery doesn't go right, then we'll take the fall. A lot of times you'd have to survive that in order to take the fall. And,
you have questions for Mr. Griffin. If you'll go ahead and pass those to the end of your rows, we'll collect them. Now, Eddie, you were in prison for 12 years, and during that time you were named a prisoner of conscience by the World Peace Council. How did you get that designation?
Well, what the federal prison system, I went to the federal prison. What they did was they took all of the quote-unquote masterminds, the who's who of crime, all the people that were considered radicals or revolutionaries or Black Panthers or however you wanted to class them, and put them into one prison. So here you have all of these quote-unquote masterminds in one prison, where the average prison guard had a sixth grade education, and it was like no competition. It was like, cat and mouse, but the mice were running circles around the cat. And so it was through my prison writings that got out to the public and was published by various newspapers around the country that they began to try to shut me down by putting me in solitary confinement. I wrote about the program that they had us in, mind control experiments. They wanted to try experiments that would cause us to be conformists or change from being radical and all of that. And that's the reason why they constructed this Supermax prison in Marion, was to conduct these experiments under the auspices of being therapeutic programs that would help reform prisoners. But actually, it was a program that played one prisoner against other prisoners, white prisoners against black prisoners, and guards against prisoners. And so survival was kind of complicated. Survival was not a matter of who was the toughest, but a matter of negotiation. We had to negotiate our daily existence because a lot of the people that I was doing time with in Supermax, 50 years was nothing. They had life, double life, and nothing to lose.
We have quite a few questions here, which is terrific, and we'll go through as many of these as we can. In retrospect, could the Black Panther movement have been more effective if other methods had been used?
Um, you, when Malcolm X said, "By any means necessary," do realize that the Black Panther Party was an alternative political party. We were all college students. We were forming a political party that would compete against the Democrats and the Republicans. How we became vilified was because of the state. You know, you have to realize that J. Edgar Hoover upheld and defended Jim Crow laws because they were the laws on record. They were the laws of the land. They were the laws that were on the book. Well, these laws were illegal as far as we were concerned, unconstitutional. You deny us the right to vote, and then if we attempt to vote, then you would wreak violence on us. We didn't feel that that was right, nor was it justified, and we had the right to defend ourselves or to take countermeasures.
How did your family react to you being a Black Panther?
My mother had to be institutionalized. She lost her sanity for a while. I was forbidden to come home. I was forced underground. I had to live underground. I had to live in abandoned apartments, and I was a fugitive for a pretty good while. I enlisted in military service under my cousin's name, and they wound up picking him up and putting him in the stockade, and so it was rough on my family. My family was completely terrified because people would follow them trying to catch up with me, and so it was hard.
Since being released from prison, have you still been involved in the struggle for equality?
Sure, sure. If it was one thing that also, let me say that the Eddie Griffin that went in is not the same man that came out. If you think that I'm the same man with the same brashness, and no, they put me in a refrigerated cell, and that was the last straw. When I came out, I came out with a mission to fulfill. I asked the guys in prison with life and double life, what is it that I can do for you? And instead of saying, send me some drugs back, put some money on my book, they said, number one, keep our kids out of here, out of these hellholes. And number two, stay out there yourself. And so I've been involved with volunteering in the school system. And if you ever heard the phrase, school to prison pipeline, I helped coin that phrase for a reason, so people could see that school discipline leads to harsh punishment that cause kids to drop out of school and wind up going to prison. We needed to break that. We need to put the authority and back into the school, into the principal's office, solve the problem where it is, where it's created, so we don't lose so many kids' life. Don't be so harsh with so much suspension, because we lose daily average attendance. And when we lose daily average attendance, then we lose money, allocation for education. This is one of the things that I get passionate on. Also, if you've heard of Jena Six, I was one of the bloggers that organized an international blogging campaign on behalf of the Jena Six for the very same reason. These kids, for a schoolyard fight, faced 80 years in prison. And so I can say that we also, the president recently instituted a policy um, on school discipline where less harsh discipline would be used. But these are some of the things that I've been involved in besides economic development and other infrastructural things that are important to propping up the community. I believe that if you raise the next generation to be competent, to be skillful, that they'll be able to solve the next generation of problems because we're not going to be around always, so we have to empower them now through education how to deal with and solve problems, not just cry about problems. You hear talk about victim, being the victim and all of that. No, people used to send us their problem so that we could solve their problem. And one of the problems that they sent to us was during the 1970s and 80s, they wrote and told us old people are eating dog food because dog food is cheaper. And so I'll use the term Black Panthers, but it was a mixed group of radicals, came up with a plan for community survival. And one of those was, deal with the abandoned land that you have. Plant food on there. Block gardens is what our suggestion was. And sure enough, that alleviated some of the hunger in the neighborhood. But unfortunately, by the time I come out, there were people who they call crackheads that didn't respect community gardens.
We have time for one last question, and I think it's a really good one considering the young people in the audience. If you were to give the young people in this room any advice on how to make positive changes in how people treat each other, what would you say?
First of all, if you strive to be the best that you can be, realize all of your potential, you don't even have to worry about the people that's around you because there's always going to be somebody that's not going to like you. If you're on your way to the top, there's probably going to be more people that hate you. But if you be the best that you can be, then you can accomplish everything that beyond your wildest dreams. And as far as people holding you back, nobody can hold you back. Only you can hold you back.
All right. Please join me in thanking Eddie Griffin for being our guest today.
Thank you so much.